So in this video, I'm going to walk through a little bit about how the Sitecore Cognitive Services Core is structured. So if you wanted to add your own API, or maybe modify one, or even just have a better understanding of how the architecture is set up, what I'm first going to do is show an example of one of the APIs, and then show you how it's been threaded through into a feature. So for example, the Microsoft, which is probably the one that I'm using the most. Here there's a number of different folders with repository classes. Now these repository classes and then their corresponding models are all part of the API connector. So this is really where the connection between the service happens. Now if you look here, there's a repository client. So every API in this project shares the same client because making connection to the API is always the same or similar between all the APIs. Each individual project like Lexalytics, IBM, they all have their own clients separately. So here this repository comes in, you're also getting an API key that's defined elsewhere. So when you're trying to make a call, in this case the autosuggest, to get suggestions based on some text, it goes to the API keys, it gets the URL, or it gets the key, ID key from the autosuggest. It uses the API endpoint, which is the URL, and the query string with the text at the end. And it passes that into the client, tells it to do a send get. So what it's going to do with this key is it's going to attach it, it's going to build headers, and then it's going to take this URL, make the request, get back an object, in this case an autosuggest response, and then I'm going to deserialize it because it's all JSON, and then return that. And all the models here are within that folder, so you can find them. But this is just one small example of how the repository works. So every project that has just a connector to an API, they're all repositories. They're getting information. They're managing back and forth. They don't know anything about Sitecore. They're very simple classes, even though this one is actually fairly large. And if you jump here to the HTTP, this is where your client exists. So you can see there's a lot of different calls and wrappers. But they all follow the same pattern, which is that there's a repository class that maps out the connection between the keys and the URLs and the parameters. There's, under HTTP, there's a client, and then each one has their own models that they use to send data back and forth. Where they actually tie into Sitecore is in this SC SDK. Now the reason this is important is because this is where they convert from being a repository into a service. And the key differentiator is that the service has keys defined, how to get the keys, and what this is doing is pulling it from content. The key item that it's referring to is an item in the content tree, and these are the API nodes under the new service section that you've created under system modules. And each of the APIs has its own key item, and it's created here, so it's getting the MS SDK. The other API keys will use a different ID to get a different item in the tree. And the reason I did this is so that in the event that you wanted to not use the API nodes or add other ones or do whatever, you could. You could go into the config here, under app config, foundation SC SDK, change the IDs of the items, change the IDs of the fields, and then you could just build your own or structure it however you wanted. It was flexible. I didn't hardcode any of the data into the application itself. And these keys are then passed into the repositories and services so that they can be used to make calls. So now I'm going to jump and show you one of the service classes. So all the service class does is wrap the repository class. So there's a repository here in the Lewis. So this endpoint comes into the service class. Policy service also comes in with the keys, the logger. And the purpose of this service class is to provide retrying efforts, logging, and just some general stability around the repository. The repository does absolutely nothing but make a call to the endpoint and come back with data. And here in the service class, what I'm doing is calling this policy service, saying catch anything that's a 400, wait for the amount of time specified in this API key that comes from the config or the content tree, and then recall this repository class in it's 3 times, I think, and then once it's done, if it fails 3 times, then it quits and it logs it every time it fails. But the purpose of having this retryer is that in Microsoft especially, every time you make an API service, there is a rate limit. So a lot of times if you're paying for it, the limit is very high and you probably will never hit it. But if you're using a free tier, which a lot of them offer, especially in development environments, you can get away with a lot just using the free service. But to make it flexible, so in my case I was analyzing a lot of images, and what I found is, thousands of images, it can analyze them pretty quickly because the APIs are very fast and responsive. I was hitting my limit very quickly. So what I needed to do was have something that realized that it was failing, wait until the timeout period was over, and then start retrying again, so that I could just say, go and analyze my media library. It may take a little longer because it's retrying, failing, and waiting, but I don't have to think about, oh, did it finish? Did it fail? Do I have to restart? How am I going to do this? I can just let it run it, and it will finish eventually. Beyond the services, there's the wrapper classes, and these are all just literal wrappers around a lot of Sitecore static calls to get data from the tree, publishing, the media library, logging, content searching, that sort of thing. It's just so I don't have to reference Sitecore in every other project. I can do it here in one and reuse it. And the areas is probably the last area where I'm adding a layout here just for the modals that I'm popping up a lot into the system, and also this speech JavaScript file, which allows you to open up a connection to the speech service from the front end, from JavaScript, and start speaking to it without having to make back-end calls. So that's it. That's the core. Beyond that, what you're going to want to know is how to wire these into features. So if you haven't seen any of the previous videos of setting these up, you should probably check those out. But what I'm going to do is just jump into this broadcast and show you quickly how this one was set up, just so that you get an idea of how the services kind of come from the core and then are used in your own feature. So again, assuming you've already set up the core, you've gone into the content tree, plugged in your API keys, maybe gone to Azure, created your services, get your keys. Now when you want to create your own service, obviously you're going to come here and you're going to reference the earlier projects. So in this case, Microsoft and the Sitecore Cognitive Services. I have references from NuGet to Sitecore, and then the rest are system level references. I'm going to create an IOC config to inject my controller and any services that I need into that controller. And then I have setup file here, config, that just basically tells that this site with this domain name and this content node, this is the site that I'm going to use. I'm referencing the IOC config as well to set that up. And then unicorn so that I can serialize anything that I've done. Now into the MVC part of this. So the view itself, I have a progress indicator I reuse. All it does is point to Sitecore's spinner. This is the main page here. And then I have a layout file which really doesn't have a lot in it. And all this is doing is there's 2 buttons, one for the male and female voice, a button to remove files, a form to submit to say turn this page's content into audio. And here's the visual of the content that it's going to translate. But really it does a lookup on the back end, so a lot of this happens in the controller. And the JavaScript, CSS that come with it, the images, they're all very minimal. Most of it is just handling the player. So the playing the button, the play buttons. The form submission is here, and all it's doing is just taking the contextual data like ID, database, and language and submitting it back to the back end. And then in the controller, there's really just one method. So the constructor takes in the speech service and the data wrapper so I can look up items. The item, it gets the item by ID, gets the content field, strips some markup from it. Not everything you see should be read. Then it sets up the file names that I'm going to create, some of the properties, and then it sends it to the speech service and says, turn this text into a file. And once I'm done, I send a success message back to the front end, and then it can refresh and use the predefined paths to find the files. And that's really all there is to it. The Blogcast is a very simple feature. Obviously it doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, but obviously if you're going to go to production, you're going to want to do a little bit more work around securing it, making sure that it is reliable, robust, and any other, industrial grade feature you're going to need when it goes into production use. Alright, so that is the in-depth version of the core and how you would either extend the core or build them into features individually. Alright, thanks for watching.